sometimes the most expensive mistake a person can make starts with a view they never owned. The smell of fresh pine hit me before I even stepped out of my truck. It was sharp, bitter, wrong. Then I heard the last chainsaw wind down into silence. I stood there with one hand on the door and watched the final 80-year-old oak crash onto the ground where my grandfather had planted it decades before I was born. The impact shook the dirt beneath my boots. A cloud of sawdust drifted through the cool Texas morning like smoke after a storm. Victoria Hawthorne didn't even bother looking guilty. She was parked on the edge of the golf course in a white luxury cart with mirrored sunglasses and a smile that could have sold a lie to a courtroom. Behind her, contractors loaded thick tree trunks onto flatbed trailers as if they were hauling away ordinary firewood instead of my family's history. She slowly clapped her hands once. Much better. Her voice carried across the open fairway. Now the members can finally enjoy the 18th hole without looking at your ugly tree line. I looked at the empty stretch where 22 massive oaks had stood only yesterday. My grandfather called them the Wall of Seasons because every fall they turned the entire ridge into a river of gold. My father taught me how to hunt squirrels beneath those branches. My mother scattered my grandfather's ashes there after he passed away. To Victoria, they were simply blocking a better golf view for wealthy homeowners who wanted prettier sunsets with their membership fees. I never raised my voice. I never argued. I simply walked toward the nearest stump and placed my hand against the fresh cut. The wood was still warm from the saw blade. Sap slowly leaked across the bright rings like tears nobody else noticed. One of the contractors shifted nervously before handing me a folded sheet of paper. It was an HOA notice claiming Emergency Landscaping Authority for community enhancement. They had even billed me for the removal crews. $14,800. I actually smiled. Victoria laughed because she mistook that smile for surrender. You should thank us, she said. Property values are about to go through the roof. I folded the paper once, slipped it into my jacket pocket, picked up a broken oak branch from the ground. Then I quietly said the only word she would hear from me that morning. I hope you enjoyed the view while it lasts. She rolled her eyes. The neighbors standing behind her whispered that I probably couldn't afford lawyers anyway. They saw an aging pickup truck, old work boots, faded jeans. They assumed I was just another stubborn landowner clinging to the past. None of them knew that the land beneath their championship golf course had been protecting something far more valuable than trees. None of them knew my grandfather had planned for greedy people long before Victoria Hawthorne was ever born. And none of them had the slightest idea that cutting those trees had just triggered the most expensive property disaster our county had ever seen. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 41 years old. Most people in Willow Creek thought I was just another quiet landowner who refused to modernize. That assumption had made life very easy for me. I drove the same 15-year-old pickup because it still worked. I wore old work boots because they were comfortable. I fixed my own fences because I enjoyed honest work. Around here people measured success by luxury cars and country club memberships. I learned a long time ago that real wealth stays quiet. My grandfather, Henry Walker, bought this land in 1954 when nobody wanted it. Back then there was no championship golf course. There were no million-dollar homes. There was only open pasture, a winding creek, and a ridge covered with young oak trees that he planted one by one with his own hands. He always told me something that sounded strange when I was a kid. He said, never think you own the land. Think about whether the land still accepts you. Every Saturday morning we walked that ridge together. The smell of fresh grass mixed with damp soil after sunrise. The breeze carried birdsong instead of golf carts. Those trees became part of our family history. My father carved our initials into one trunk after I turned 12. My grandfather laughed because he said trees remembered people better than photographs ever could. Years later I inherited every acre after both of them passed away. I never sold a single foot of it. Developers offered unbelievable amounts of money. Golf investors came with polished presentations and expensive watches. Realtors promised that progress would make everyone rich. I thanked every one of them for their time and politely declined. That became something of a local legend. People assumed I was stubborn. Victoria preferred another word. She called me selfish during more than one homeowners association meeting. According to her, my tree line blocked premium views for the houses overlooking the 18th fairway. She claimed better scenery would increase neighborhood values. Every sentence sounded reasonable until you remembered one simple fact. None of those trees belonged to her. Over the years, she sent landscaping suggestions disguised as official notices. She offered to trim branches. Then she offered to relocate several trees. Eventually, she proposed removing the entire line in exchange for decorative shrubs. I rejected every proposal. Calmly. Respectfully. Always in writing. Every reply ended with the same sentence. My property will remain exactly as it is. Each rejection seemed to make her smile disappear a little more. Looking back now, I realized she had already stopped asking for permission long before the chainsaws arrived. The strange part was not that she wanted a prettier golf course. Wealthy neighborhoods chase appearances all the time. The strange part was how confident she became. It was as if she believed nobody could stop her anymore. Neighbors started treating the tree line like it was already community property. Real estate brochures quietly described homes as having protected golf course views. Weekend visitors wandered close to my fence taking photographs without asking. Someone even installed a small directional sign pointing toward what they called the scenic overlook. Every step happened slowly enough that most people never questioned it. Rights disappear that way sometimes. Not with loud arguments. With quiet assumptions repeated often enough that people mistake them for facts. I noticed every single change. I simply chose not to react. Patience has a way of making arrogant people reveal far more than they intended. Victoria believed silence meant weakness. She never imagined it could also mean preparation. The chainsaws were gone by the next morning. The silence felt heavier than the noise they left behind. Fresh stumps stretched across my ridge like empty chairs after a family reunion. The sharp scent of raw oak still lingered in the cool air. Every passing breeze carried sawdust across the fairway that Victoria had worked so hard to improve. By sunrise, the neighborhood was already celebrating. The golf club sent photographers to capture the newly opened view. Real estate agents gathered near the cart path with coffee cups in their hands. They smiled as drones floated overhead, recording promotional videos for luxury listings. I watched them from my porch without saying a word. One photographer even stepped onto my property without asking. He adjusted his camera toward the fairway and proudly announced that buyers would finally see an uninterrupted championship landscape. Nobody corrected him. That afternoon, my mailbox held another certified envelope. Inside was a letter from the Homeowners Association thanking me for my cooperation during the community beautification project. They attached a bill for the removal crews. $14,800. They also included a monthly landscaping assessment to maintain the improved scenic corridor. Scenic corridor. That was the phrase they chose for land they did not own. I could not help smiling again. Victoria must have mistaken my silence for surrender because she arrived at my driveway before lunch wearing a bright white golf outfit that matched her oversized visor. Her perfume reached me before she did. She stood beside my fence with 2 board members and a local realtor. None of them asked permission to be there. Victoria folded her arms and admired the empty skyline. She said the neighborhood had never looked better. She said buyers were already calling about homes that had been sitting on the market for months. She even joked that perhaps I should remove the rest of my trees. While I was at it, the others laughed as if they had rehearsed the moment together. Then she handed me another document. This one requested permanent access across the edge of my property so golf carts could stop and enjoy the expanded overlook. She called it a simple community partnership. I looked down at the paper. The ink was still fresh enough to smell. She had already highlighted the signature line. I folded it neatly and placed it beside the first notice inside my jacket pocket. I thanked her for stopping by. Her smile widened. She believed she had finally broken my stubbornness. As they drove away in their golf carts, I noticed something interesting. New wooden stakes had appeared along the property line. Bright orange survey ribbons fluttered in the afternoon wind. They had already begun measuring for decorative fencing and observation benches. Nobody had requested a survey. Nobody had informed the county. They simply acted as though repeating the same lie often enough would eventually make it legal. That evening I made a pot of coffee and walked into the old workshop behind my house. Dust floated through the narrow beams of light coming from the windows. My grandfather kept every document he ever signed inside weathered steel filing cabinets that smelled faintly of machine oil and cedar. I ran my hand across the drawers until I found the one marked Ridge easement. I did not open it yet. Not because I was uncertain. Because I wanted every move they made before I made mine. Arrogance always grows louder right before it collapses. Victoria still thought she was improving a golf course. She had no idea she was quietly building the foundation for the largest financial disaster that neighborhood had ever experienced. The first lawyer I visited barely looked up from his desk before asking one question. Was I willing to spend at least $200,000 fighting the Homeowners Association? I laughed because the number did not surprise me. His answer did. He explained that the board had already presented signed contractor invoices, public relations statements, and witness declarations claiming the trees posed safety concerns for golfers. He slid the folder back across the desk and quietly suggested mediation. I thanked him for his time and walked out. The smell of fresh coffee from the lobby followed me into the parking lot. It tasted almost as bitter as the advice I had just received. My second stop was the county office. The clerk listened politely while typing notes into her computer. She frowned when she reached the permit records. There were none. No tree removal permit. No environmental review. No authorization from my office because nobody had ever contacted me. She apologized and explained that enforcement could take months while multiple departments reviewed jurisdiction. Months. Victoria had needed one morning to erase 80 years. The government needed months just to decide whose desk the paperwork belonged on. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had completely embraced its new reality. Golf magazines published glossy photographs of the expanded fairway. Luxury real estate websites proudly advertised panoramic course views. A developer even announced plans for another row of premium homes overlooking what they now described as permanently protected scenery. That phrase almost made me laugh out loud. Permanently protected. They were selling a promise built on land they did not control. Every new advertisement quietly increased the financial stakes without anyone realizing it. Victoria grew even bolder. She held an outdoor board meeting beside the freshly cleared ridge. Folding chairs lined the edge of my property. Caterers served sparkling water and pastries. I watched from across the fence while members applauded her leadership. She thanked the landscaping committee for improving community value. Then she unveiled architectural sketches for decorative stone seating along the overlook. The audience cheered. One homeowner asked whether the association actually owned that section of land. Victoria smiled with absolute confidence. She said legal details had already been handled. Hearing those words confirmed something I had suspected for days. She was no longer making assumptions. She was making representations that other people were beginning to rely upon. That changed everything. Later that afternoon, another certified envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one contained notice of additional fines because my remaining tree stumps supposedly created an unattractive appearance from the golf course. They demanded I grind them down within 14 days or face daily penalties. I set the letter beside the others on my kitchen table. 4 notices. 4 separate claims. Every page carried the same official logo. Every page quietly expanded their position. Outside my window, the evening sun poured across the empty ridge. Without the old oaks, the wind moved differently. Dust drifted over the fairway in slow rolling waves. Golfers shielded their eyes while putting on the 18th green. They complained about the glare. Nobody connected it to the missing trees. I poured another cup of coffee and finally opened the steel filing cabinet in my workshop. The old drawer resisted before sliding free with a dry metallic scrape. Inside rested thick folders wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Survey maps, easement agreements, handwritten engineering notes. Every page smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. My grandfather never threw anything away. He believed forgotten documents were often worth more than remembered promises. As I lifted the first folder onto the workbench, I realized Victoria had spent weeks celebrating a victory that existed only because nobody had bothered to read what had been sitting quietly in this cabinet for more than half a century. The first map I unfolded covered nearly my entire workbench. Thick survey lines crossed the page in faded black ink. Handwritten notes filled the margins of my grandfather's careful script. The paper crackled softly as I smoothed the corners beneath my palms. The smell of old cedar and machine oil surrounded me. Then I saw the sentence that changed everything. Scenic Preservation Easement. Recorded in 1968. I blinked twice just to make sure I was reading it correctly. My grandfather had negotiated the agreement decades before anyone even imagined building a golf course nearby. He had donated a narrow environmental buffer along the ridge to the county under one condition. The natural skyline could never be altered without written approval from the adjoining landowner. That adjoining landowner was now me. I kept reading. Every future development built beside the ridge accepted the easement automatically through the chain of title. That meant every homeowner, every developer, every investor, even the golf club itself. Nobody could legally remove vegetation or permanently change the visual barrier without my signed consent. I had never signed anything. My heartbeat stayed perfectly calm. I reached for another folder. Inside rested engineering drawings from 1971. Heavy steel retaining systems. Wind studies. Soil reports. At first they seemed unrelated. Then another handwritten note caught my attention. If natural barrier is ever destroyed, owner may install engineered replacement for erosion and wind protection. Subject only to county structural approval. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My grandfather had anticipated something like this more than 50 years ago. He trusted trees first. But if the trees ever disappeared, the documents explicitly allowed a permanent structural barrier. I quietly laughed to myself. Outside the workshop I could hear distant cheers from the golf course as another group finished the 18th hole. They had no idea that every celebration echoed across land protected by paperwork older than most of the houses surrounding them. The next morning I drove to the county archives. An elderly records supervisor named Harold greeted me with a polite smile. He adjusted his glasses and carefully compared my original documents with the official record books. After nearly an hour he looked up and nodded once. Every easement was still active. Every restriction remained enforceable. Nothing had ever been amended or released. He asked one simple question. Did someone actually remove the barrier without your authorization? I slid several recent photographs across the counter. Fresh stumps. Contractor equipment. Promotional signs advertising the new view. Harold slowly exhaled through his nose. He whispered that somebody had made a very expensive assumption. I thanked him and requested certified copies of every recorded document. By late afternoon I carried a thick binder back to my truck. The weight felt satisfying. Not because it represented revenge. Because it represented certainty. That evening my telephone rang. Victoria sounded unusually cheerful. She announced that the Homeowners Association had scheduled a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new overlook the following weekend. She even invited me to attend as a gesture of neighborhood unity. I thanked her for the invitation. I told her I would be busy preparing a construction project on my property. She laughed softly and asked what I planned to build now that the trees were gone. I looked through my workshop window toward the empty ridge glowing beneath the setting sun. Then I answered honestly. A replacement. One that nobody will ever be able to cut down again. 3 days later the county planning office approved every page of my application. The clerk stamped the final permit with a heavy metal seal that echoed across the quiet office. The sound was oddly satisfying. No appeals. No objections. No emergency hearing. Everything complied with county code because every measurement came directly from engineering standards that had been sitting in my grandfather's files for decades. The official description listed the project as a permanent structural wind and erosion barrier. There was nothing emotional about it. Nothing personal. Just steel, concrete, soil stabilization, and property rights. Early Monday morning, the first trucks rolled onto my land. Their diesel engines rumbled through the cool air long before sunrise. Neighbors gathered along the golf cart paths holding coffee cups as they watched flatbed trailers unload enormous steel columns. Each section looked like the frame of a commercial bridge. Victoria drove over before the crane had finished lifting the first beam into place. She climbed out of her golf cart wearing the same confident smile she always carried whenever she believed she was in control. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I handed her a laminated copy of the county permit without saying another word. She scanned the first page. Then the second. Her smile faded for the first time since the trees disappeared. She insisted the homeowners association would never allow something so ugly beside the golf course. I calmly reminded her that the construction site was entirely on my property. She threatened lawsuits. I pointed toward the county approval stamp. She threatened fines. I reminded her that homeowners association rules ended at my property line. She finally drove away while talking rapidly on her telephone. By noon, attorneys representing the golf club arrived in expensive suits that looked completely out of place beside heavy equipment and muddy work boots. They politely asked whether I would consider reducing the height of the structure. I asked whether anyone had considered asking permission before removing 22 mature oak trees. Nobody answered. Instead, they offered mediation, then financial compensation, then a landscaping partnership. Every offer arrived too late. I thanked them for their professionalism and continued watching the crane lower another steel column into fresh concrete. Over the next several days, the barrier slowly climbed higher. 10 feet. 15 feet. Then 20 feet. Welders filled the morning air with bright flashes and the sharp scent of hot steel. The rhythmic clanging echoed across the fairway from sunrise until late afternoon. Golfers stopped on the 18th hole to stare upward as the wall gradually replaced the skyline they had celebrated only a week earlier. Real estate agents quietly removed promotional signs advertising panoramic course views. Drone photographers stopped showing up. The neighborhood message board exploded with complaints about construction noise, even though every permit allowed the exact working hours being followed. Victoria called an emergency homeowners association meeting. She stood before frustrated residents promising she would stop the project immediately. Unfortunately for her, every attorney she contacted reached the same conclusion. The county could not legally deny a compliant structure built entirely on private property under an active recorded easement. One lawyer reportedly described the situation with a sentence that spread through the neighborhood before sunset. Somebody cut down the only thing preventing him from building the only thing you cannot remove. By the end of the week, the final steel panel locked into place with a deep metallic thud that rolled across the golf course like distant thunder. The evening sun disappeared behind 20 feet of weathered steel. The fairway fell into cool shadow for the first time in its history. I stood quietly beside the finished barrier, while the breeze carried away the last smell of fresh welding. My grandfather had planted trees because they were beautiful. Other people chose to destroy them. I simply replaced beauty with permanence. And the real cost of that decision had not even begun to reveal itself. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. At first, people complained about the wall itself. Then they started noticing everything that came with it. The morning sun no longer spilled across the 18th fairway the way it used to. Afternoon winds bounced off the steel surface and changed the way golfers judged every approach shot. The practice green stayed cooler. The expensive landscaping along the ridge struggled without the same light it had enjoyed for years. None of those changes violated a single regulation. They were simply the natural result of replacing a living barrier with a permanent engineered one. Within 2 weeks, the golf club canceled a regional tournament that had been scheduled for early autumn. The organizers quietly cited changes to the playing environment and unexpected visual conditions. Local newspapers picked up the story before anyone at the Homeowners Association could control the narrative. Reporters wanted to know why one of the most photographed holes in the county suddenly faced a 20-foot steel backdrop. The answer was simple. Because someone removed what had been there first. Luxury real estate agents felt the impact next. Homes advertised with premium golf course views suddenly required updated listing photographs. Buyers who arrived expecting wide open scenery instead found a massive weathered steel barrier stretching across the horizon. Contracts stalled. Open houses grew quiet. One broker estimated that several pending sales lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in combined value during a single month. Nobody blamed the wall. They blamed the decisions that made the wall legally possible. Victoria refused to accept reality. She organized another emergency meeting inside the clubhouse. This time the room sounded completely different. Residents were not applauding. They were asking questions. One homeowner demanded to know why mature trees had been removed without verifying ownership. Another wanted to know who approved promotional materials advertising views that were never guaranteed. A retired accountant calmly asked whether the association's insurance policy covered unauthorized work performed on private property. The room fell silent. Nobody answered immediately. I learned later that the board spent hours reviewing policy language with outside counsel. The answer was devastating. Because the tree removal had not been authorized by the actual property owner. Several liability protections could be challenged. Suddenly every invoice, every contractor agreement, every promotional statement, every official meeting minute became potential evidence instead of routine paperwork. The financial pressure spread quickly. The golf club postponed expansion plans. A developer delayed construction on a luxury section overlooking the fairway. Lenders requested additional reviews before releasing funds tied to future home sales. Even businesses outside the neighborhood noticed fewer visitors stopping for lunch after weekend tournaments disappeared from the calendar. All of it traced back to one decision made for a prettier view. I continued my normal routine through every headline. Every morning I repaired fences, fed my horses, drank coffee on the porch while the breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh hay across my property. The steel wall reflected soft, golden light at sunrise instead of harsh glare. It was quiet again. Peaceful. Exactly what my grandfather had always wanted this land to be. One afternoon, Harold from the county archives called me. His voice sounded unusually serious. He said several attorneys had requested certified copies of the same easement records I had reviewed weeks earlier. Developers, insurance companies, private investors. They all wanted the original documents now. I thanked him and hung up. That was the moment I realized the story had moved far beyond a disagreement between one homeowner and one overconfident board president. The wall had become the smallest part of a much larger disaster. The real collapse was happening inside conference rooms where people with expensive suits were finally calculating the price of assuming that somebody else's property rights did not matter. The first lawsuit arrived less than 3 weeks after the wall was finished. Then another followed. By the end of the month, every law firm in the county seemed to know the name Willow Creek Estates. Thick envelopes arrived at the Homeowners Association office every morning. Certified mail stacked across the reception desk faster than anyone could process it. The pleasant smell of fresh flowers that once filled the clubhouse had been replaced by printer toner and cardboard shipping boxes carrying legal records. Residents stopped waving at Victoria when she drove through the neighborhood. Instead, they waited for answers she could not give. One evening I received an unexpected telephone call from the chairman of the golf club. His voice sounded exhausted. He asked whether I would be willing to discuss possible solutions over dinner. I accepted because I believed in listening before speaking. We met inside the nearly empty clubhouse where expensive crystal glasses sat untouched beneath soft lighting. He admitted the club had already lost several major corporate events. Membership renewals were slowing. Investors wanted explanations. Insurance companies wanted documentation. Everyone wanted somebody else to accept responsibility. I simply listened. Then I placed certified copies of the easement agreement beside his coffee cup. He read every page without interrupting. When he finally looked up, he quietly asked the question nobody else had bothered asking from the beginning. Why did nobody check these records before touching your property? I told him I had been wondering the same thing. A week later, another surprise arrived. The golf club announced an independent, internal investigation into every decision connected to the unauthorized tree removal. Contractors were interviewed. Emails were collected. Meeting minutes were reviewed. Promotional brochures were compared against recorded property documents. The investigation uncovered something remarkable. Victoria had repeatedly assured board members that legal ownership questions had already been resolved. She had never produced supporting documentation because nobody demanded to see it. Confidence had replaced verification. Assumptions had replaced facts. Those assumptions now carried an astonishing financial cost. During the following month, the Homeowners Association's insurance carrier issued a formal reservation of rights letter. Several claims might not qualify for full coverage because the work had been performed on private property without confirmed authorization. The announcement spread through the neighborhood faster than any rumor I had ever heard. Homeowners who once applauded the expanded golf view suddenly realized special assessments might eventually be used to cover legal expenses. Attendance at board meetings doubled almost overnight. Every chair filled before the meetings even started. Voices stayed controlled, but the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Then the final twist arrived without any dramatic announcement. A financial publication covering commercial real estate released an article identifying the ownership structure behind the engineering company that had fabricated every steel panel used in my barrier. The company had quietly grown into one of the largest specialty structural manufacturers in the region after I sold daily operations years earlier while retaining a controlling ownership interest. Reporters quickly connected my name to public corporate filings. The same neighbors who believed I could not afford a lawyer suddenly discovered I had never been pretending to survive. I had simply chosen to live quietly. Victoria reportedly stared at the article for several minutes before saying a single word. She had spent months assuming an old pickup truck represented my entire life. She never imagined that the man she dismissed as an ordinary landowner had the resources to wait patiently while everyone else rushed toward the most expensive mistake they would ever make. By then it no longer mattered who believed me. The documents had spoken. The permits had spoken. The market had spoken. And the consequences were only beginning. 6 months later, the ridge looked alive again. Not because the old oaks had returned. Nothing could replace 80 years of history. But a new row of young native trees stretched across the inside of my property behind the steel barrier. Every sapling stood protected from careless hands. Morning dew gathered on fresh leaves while the soft smell of damp soil reminded me of childhood walks with my grandfather. The steel wall remained exactly where the law allowed it to stand. It no longer felt like a symbol of anger. It had become a reminder that rights ignored eventually become rights enforced. Willow Creek Estates never fully recovered from what happened. Several board members quietly resigned before the annual election. New leadership promised transparency and mandatory legal reviews before approving any project involving neighboring property. The expensive promotional signs advertising guaranteed golf course views disappeared one by one. Some homeowners eventually sold their houses. Others stayed and accepted that shortcuts often cost far more than patience ever does. I never celebrated any of it. There was nothing joyful about watching an entire community pay the price for the arrogance of a few people. One crisp autumn morning I received a handwritten letter from the new Homeowners Association president. Inside was a simple apology. No legal language. No excuses. Just an honest acknowledgement that my family had been wrong. Enclosed was a resolution adopted unanimously by the new board recognizing the original Walker tree line as an important part of the community's history. They even asked permission to install a small historical marker outside my property explaining why respect for property rights mattered. I agreed on one condition. The marker would not mention my name. It would simply remind future generations that ownership is not determined by popularity. It is determined by law and responsibility. A month later I stood quietly as workers placed the bronze plaque beside the old walking path. The cool meadow reflected the afternoon sun while children rode bicycles nearby without knowing the full story behind it. I smiled because that was exactly how it should be. Lessons that last the longest usually become ordinary parts of everyday life. Every now and then I still see golfers pause near the 18th fairway. Some glance toward the steel barrier with curious expressions. Others notice the line of young trees growing taller each season behind it. They never realize they are looking at two generations of the same lesson. One planted with hope. The other built because hope alone was no longer enough. People sometimes ask whether I would ever remove the wall if enough years passed. I always give the same answer. The day someone can return every tree exactly as it stood before they cut the first branch is the day I will consider it. Until then the wall stays. It follows every permit, every survey, every recorded easement, every legal requirement that should have been respected from the beginning. On quiet evenings I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sunset disappear behind the steel before its light filters gently through the growing leaves beyond it. The birds have already returned. The wind sounds different now. Softer somehow. My grandfather once told me that land remembers every decision made upon it. Standing there today I finally understand what he meant. Some people looked at those trees and saw an obstacle to a better view. I looked at them and saw a promise worth protecting. They chose convenience. I chose patience. They believed power belonged to whoever spoke the loudest. In the end, the only voice that truly mattered was the one already written into the land itself. Justice never needed to shout. It only needed someone willing to let the truth stand as firmly as steel.